Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, November 1st, 2023. And if you're anything like me, you've probably heard plenty of people talking about whether or not we are officially going to get in an economic crisis, whether it's going to happen, or whether it's going to be a soft landing, all this stuff that they've been talking about. But I would argue that based on the views of the founders regarding things like massive deficits and a national debt, we've been in a crisis all along, a crisis of too much government power. And I think that should be obvious. But I know that some people, definitely not you, of course. Some people, as soon as they hear anything about economy or deficits or spending or debt, they immediately think, boring. But we're going to push on, and well, maybe I'll make this exciting. I'm not 100% sure. I'm going to do my best to share the information. Here's how I want to start it out with an article we just published a few days ago by Mike Meharry. Fiscal 2023 federal budget deficit, third largest ever. At least it wasn't the worst, right? If you're third worst, it's terrible when you're under the largest government in history. And that's how Mike puts it. It takes a lot of money to run the biggest government in the history of the world. The federal government ran a $1.695 trillion budget deficit. We're closing in on $2 trillion in the hole for fiscal 2023. This was the third largest deficit in U.S. history. And he goes on. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the national debt blew past $33 trillion on September 15th. Just 20 days later, this should hopefully, I know the numbers are so incredibly astronomical that it's hard to really wrap your head around how much this really is. But it is so ruinous. Whether it's going to completely destroy us today or somewhere down the line, I cannot tell you, but it is incredibly ruinous. 20 days later, it pushed about $33.5 trillion. In other words, the government added $500 billion to the debt in just 20 days. Not even 3 full weeks, and they're blasting through $500 billion. Now, here's how James Madison put it. And this is a letter to Henry Lee in April of 1790. I go on the principle that a public debt is a public curse. And this is correct times 33.5 trillion. A public debt is a public curse. And the reason is the founders understood that an ongoing, other than Alexander Hamilton and a few others, that a permanent debt, especially a massive one, spending yourself into the hole, leads to all kinds of problems, both foreign and domestic. It leads sometimes to wars, and sometimes it's just a war on the liberty of the people. In fact, that's a constant. So the one curse that we generally all pay attention to, you and I and most average people, how it impacts the economy, our day-to-day life, how much we have to work to pay the bills, how much the day-to-day stuff costs. And, that's kind of a standard view. But if we're just looking from that point, here's how Peter Schiff put it in a recent podcast. Nobody understands that this crisis has started. So whether or not we look at the broader definition of how I'm looking at an economic crisis, a crisis of spending too much, a crisis of too much government power, a crisis of attacking your liberty in order to fund all this stuff, whether it's through stealing through the IRS or it's through, the inflation tax, destroying your purchasing power by just printing stuff out of thin air. But if we're looking at the more traditional and more modern sense of what an economic crisis is, whether it's going to be a soft landing, a hard landing, or a lot of people are going to lose their jobs and their homes, Schiff puts it this way. Nobody understands that this crisis has started. But believe me, it has. This was the way the 2008 financial crisis started. It didn't just happen when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. Of course, that was the outgrowth of it. The crisis led to those things. And of course, a lot of people point to just the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers as if it's just some bad company doing something and then government has to come in and protect us from that. Now, here's how Wall Street Silver put it in a post on X. The U.S. Treasury borrowed over $1 trillion borrowed during the July through September quarter that just ended, another record. We are entering the doom loop, a cycle that's going to keep spiraling out of control is basically what he's saying. All of the debt maturing is old debt that was at 1% to 2% rates, and it's getting refinanced at 5% rates. Now, that's not an argument against rates raising. We just don't like the artificial manipulation and the result of actually manipulating the rates low and then having to keep spending and paying all this stuff and borrowing in order to fund all the spending leads to a totally nasty scenario. So interest payments, Wall Street Silver says, on the national debt are rapidly rising above $1 trillion annually just for the interest. And that may, within a few years, become the item in the budget bigger, the big item in the budget, bigger than Social Security, Medicare. It's already bigger than the defense budget, which is larger than the next 8 to 10 countries combined. The largest military empire on earth, they're always telling us the military's being decimated, even though it's larger than all these. The spending that they put is just insane. And George Washington, this is part of, he was seriously motivated by getting rid of debts. Whether he was able to accomplish that or not, we can debate that. But here in his 5th annual message to Congress, December 3rd, 1793, he said, no pecuniary consideration is more urgent. This is the most urgent financial situation, according to George Washington. No pecuniary consideration is more urgent than the regular redemption and discharge of the public debt. On none can delay be more injurious or an economy of time more valuable. So to George Washington, the most dangerous thing you can do when you have a debt. Now, he wasn't against having them, and he talked about this in his farewell address as well. But it's having good public credit, not taking on a lot of debt, is a source of strength and security. So it's dangerous to foreign policy to always be indebted to others, especially if you think about who they're indebted to these days as well. So the best way to be strong is, well, when you have to take on debt, pay it off quickly. And that's what he was saying here in 1793 as well. But they're getting nowhere close to that. Nothing anywhere close to paying it off. And according to Shift Gold here on X, posted on just yesterday, the U.S. Treasury says it expects to borrow another $776 billion just in quarter 4. This would set a fourth quarter record. So they're blasting through record after record after record in how much debt they're putting upon us. Now, some people want to take the position, oh, you never have to pay it back. You don't have to worry about that. Stuff's boring. Don't. But it really is, as Daniel Lacal, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but I've read a few of his articles. This is one from Mises.org talking about how these huge deficits, spending less than they take in, too much spending, too much borrowing, too much debt, this is the road to ruin. And he's not alone, and I'm going to keep going back to the founding generation to back this up as well. Deficits, he writes, are always a spending problem. I mean, if you think about your own life, if you're spending more than you take in, eventually you're going to be ruined. You're going to be out of a home. They think that just because the government is so powerful, we don't have to worry about this, but things that can't go on forever don't. I got that from the great Chalmers Johnson when I went to an event that he spoke at before he passed some years ago. But deficits are always a spending problem. Massively monetizing government spending was the cause of inflation. We're talking about price increases. The excessive money that they print, the excessive money growth, created a persistent inflationary problem that continues to this day, even with declining monetary aggregates. It gets a little geeky, but I encourage you to read that in some detail. It's really, really good. But here's one other piece that I want to take from Daniel's article at Mises. That is, there is no free government money. High public deficits mean lower growth, lower real wages, and more debt in the future. All of this leads to higher taxes and persistent inflation. So the harder you work to pay more money to government, and then at the same time, because of the inflation, the depreciation of your purchasing power, depreciation of the money is how the founding generation referred to it. When you print more money, it has less purchasing power. That gives us price inflation. So all of these things make your life less good. It makes it much more difficult. Now, this doesn't affect the rich and powerful, and I don't really like getting into a class warfare mentality, that Marxist stuff, but the truth is the people with most power, really, this is a way to keep a population kind of on its knees, if you think about it. And that doesn't mean every business dude is out for this. They don't want to have to spend more money on everything either in general. I mean, some of them probably don't care because it's a way to subjugate others. But the people who really are interested in keeping the population on its knees, this is one of the best ways to do it. High public deficits mean lower growth, lower wages, more debt, all of it leads to higher taxes and persistent inflation, another tax, maybe the most insidious one. And again, there is no free government money. You wanted a stimulus check? You have high inflation and negative real wage growth. If the U.S. does not eliminate the deficit, it will put the U.S. dollar at risk. And once you get to that, then you get into a situation of foreign policy issues as well. And Thomas Jefferson, I didn't have it ready for this episode, but he had one great quote that I absolutely love, that he basically said, if every generation just paid off the debts as it goes, it would probably eliminate about half the wars in the world. But here's how Brutus, the great anti-federalist, put it in his 8th paper. I can scarcely contemplate a greater calamity that could befall this country than to be loaded with a debt exceeding their ability ever to discharge. Now, I'm primarily talking about the economic impacts. The impacts on your day-to-day life, my day-to-day life, everyone's day-to-day life, even the people who can afford to deal with this kind of stuff. It impacts them as well. But that's only one part of the problem, because there is so much more. It creates an environment for total despotism and total tyranny. I'll get to that in just a moment, but I want to point out that all these things that I'm mentioning in this episode, the other articles, a couple of original source documents, the Mises article, some Schiff Gold, some posts on X, etc., these are all going to be linked to over in the show notes. Alan Mosley has been an absolute machine getting those organized. Every time I have an episode, usually Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I appreciate you guys giving me a day off this past Monday to celebrate my anniversary. It was pretty awesome. And we're still celebrating throughout the week. But about a couple of hours after the live stream is done, we'll have this blog post published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty, like we do for every episode. And on each episode, you're going to find all kinds of stuff. The way it's laid out, at least for now, I want to come up with a better template for this at some point when I have a little extra time, if that ever happens. But at the top, you get an overview of the episode and then an audio player, link to some of the podcast platforms we're on, the video player, and then a show link section. So if you're wondering, hey, where was that article from Mises.org, you're going to see it linked there in the show notes. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. And while we're here, I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I really appreciate you being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, thank you so much. There's Baz and Kirk Morrison, Cheriton Farmer, Murray Ray in Michigan, Ragnar, Howard Clegg, King Nobody, Haji 1954, and a few others. I'm scrolling through. I see some back and forth there. Peter over on Facebook and everyone else. I really appreciate you guys being here. Thank you so much. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty is where we're going to see the blog post in a couple hours. Anyways, back to Mike Meharry here. Just checking my screen to make sure I have everything up there. Of course, how are they going to deal with this? What do they tell us is the problem? They never want to tell us that spending is the problem. They never tell us that printing money is the problem, or stimulus checks, or shutdowns that gave them the excuse to do it, and then people were okay with that because they just think short term. Oh, I got $1,400. I'm never going to think about how that impacts me in 5 years because my mentality is what's going to happen in the next 30 days because, well, they've been subjugating us financially for so many years, really, or preparing us for this. So there's not a lot of savings. That's through manipulation. But anyways, they're not looking at any of those things as the problem. And we're talking about our great buddy, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, whatever we want to call her. She's the felon. She was quick to blame, Mike writes, falling tax receipts, having a deficit. She's blaming the deficit on not enough IRS collection, falling tax receipts for the big deficit, and said it, quote, underscores the importance of the president's enacted and proposed policies to reform the tax system. In other words, they're not giving enough money to the IRS, which, well, we know if you really believe in freedom, that organization has got to be one of the worst. It should absolutely not exist. Those people need to have jobs. But she's saying the problem is never too much spending, too much government. too much printing, the Federal Reserve, none of that is ever an issue. Those are all wonderful things. The problem is that the bad people are not coughing up enough through voluntary compliance, and so therefore the IRS needs to get in there and force it out of you. In other words, that's all they want is more enforcement, and it's never enough for these people. And so I'm going to get into a warning from James Madison that includes that in just a moment. But here from Roll Call, they talk about this recent, if you've heard about this, another $80 billion for the IRS. And they claim that it's for customer service. It's not really for enforcement. And this is even in the article here. Not all of the additional funds go to tax enforcement under the new law. Of the total new $79.6 billion appropriation over 10 years, 45.6% is for enforcement. I went to government school, so my math skills are terrible. I wasn't taught how to do much in government school other than cause trouble because it was bad. So somewhere over half of it is what they claim is for enforcement, that they can directly say these people are coming to get you. Another $3.2 billion is set aside for taxpayer services, like it's a customer, like you're going to a department store and you got to talk to customer service. These are just your friendly customer service agents at the IRS. They're there to help you. They're not there to participate. The whole system is there for enforcement. So if they provide better customer service, that's not service. That's better customer theft. Another $3.2 billion is set aside for services. $25.3 billion for operations budget. I mean, if they can't operate properly, they can't enforce. So this is all enforcement to me. And $4.8 billion would go towards system modernization. Make it better to enforce, to collect. Every penny that they get is for enforcement, whether directly or indirectly. So we've got tons of debt. We have tons of spending. We've got tons of taxes. They want more taxes. They'll never get enough in taxes. All the printing and inflation tax as well. And then we have basically a kind of a de facto standing army that is the IRS and so many other federal agencies to go along with the other standing army that the founders repeatedly warned us against. Here's how James Madison put it. I cite this all the time. April 20th, 1795. Again, that will be linked to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But James Madison told us that armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. So we've got the largest military empire on earth. We've got probably the largest domestic standing army, de facto standing army of militarized federal agencies. We're not going just with the IRS, but there's a massive kind of militarized federal police apparatus. And then, of course, the local police that participate in that as well, but that's another story. Tons of armies. We have tons of debts. If you're thinking about, borrowing almost $800 billion in just a quarter, talking about another trillion added on, 500 billion in just 20 days. All of stuff is massive debts. And we already have a lot of taxes. Even if they don't point to the direct money that they're stealing from you, whether you voluntarily go along or not, is under a threat of force. I can't imagine too many people looking at the U.S. central government as a charity as if they were told, hey, we're not going to do any enforcement, that all kinds of people are just going to give them as much money as they want. This is under threat of enforcement, is under threat of violence against you at all times. And we've got tons of armies, tons of debts, tons of taxes. Of course, Yanet wants to give us even more because it's not enough enforcement. The big problem we have is that there's not enough tax collection. That's really the issue that we have. It's always not enough tax collection for these people. Anyways, we've got a trifecta there. And here's how Mike Meharry put it somewhere. If I can figure out where I've put this, I have no idea. Oh, here's how he put it. The national debt has been growing for so long that most people just shrug when we talk about it. They don't care. Nobody seems particularly concerned outside a handful of contrarians. Maybe us, maybe you, maybe me. But he says the most likely scenario is that spending will continue to climb along with the budget deficits. There's no telling how high these annual deficits could run. It's a fiscal powder keg. All it needs is a match. So some people think, no big deal. We can't worry about this. Maybe it's because it's so massive or because, government-run schooling told them, don't worry about this stuff. But Mike puts it this way. Sure, most everybody recognizes that this might be a problem down the road, but they believe that the road is long, so we can get away with continuing to kick the can. But mark my words, eventually they will run out of road. And that's how they put it over at Schiff Gold as well, probably written by Meharry, who's been working with them for quite some time. He said, the national debt is unsustainable. Sure, the government can kick the can down the road, but every road has its end. So the debt, the spending, the inflation, the printing, the depreciation, this gives us one immediate problem, one that's right in front of our face, that is booms and busts. It destroys the economy. It destroys purchasing power. It distorts the economy. They're manipulating things to do favors for, well, their backers, their supporters. And it's all at your expense. That's one right in front of our face. But this is also a tool of oppression. Armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. And if that doesn't, from James Madison, if that doesn't hit home, I don't know what will. Here, Thomas Jefferson wrote this to George Washington, talking about a permanent debt. Of course, Washington in 1793 was saying, hey, we got to get the debt paid down as quickly as possible. This is urgent. He repeated it again in his farewell address a few times in between. You got to pay this stuff down. But Thomas Jefferson in 1792 wrote, talking about his views versus Alexander Hamilton's. And he says, this exactly marks the difference between Colonel Hamilton's views and mine, that I would wish the debt paid tomorrow. He wishes it never to be paid, but always to be a thing wherewith to corrupt and manage the legislature. So if you think about what Janet was having to say, we need more power in the IRS. We need more enforcement by the IRS. We need more tools to create better voluntary compliance, which is not really voluntary compliance for the IRS. She's basically saying, well, we've got all this deficit. We're going to keep the spending, but this will manipulate the legislature maybe into spending more money on the IRS. This is exactly how it's playing out. We've had the Hamiltonian approach ever since, unfortunately, and it is absolutely destroying our liberty, giving us the largest government in history. Thomas Jefferson was absolutely right. I think no one sums this up better than Lysander Spooner right at the very, very end of No Treason number 6. Again, this will be linked to in the show notes. You should read it in full. And Spooner put it this way: the lesson taught by all these facts is this: as long as mankind continue to pay national debts, so-called, that is, so long as they are such dupes and cowards as to pay for being cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, so long there will be enough to lend the money for those purposes. And with that money, a plenty of tools called soldiers can be hired to keep them in subjection. And with that money, a plenty of tools called soldiers can be hired to keep them in subjection. Lysander Spooner absolutely nailed it. I think that's a great example of what we live under today. As long as people continue to go along with this, it will never change. As long as people are focused on just choosing Team A versus Team B, both of which do all of this horrible stuff, the debt ceiling deal. Can you remember being told how that was going to limit some of the spending and that was going to cut back on how bad it was going to be? It's always the same story over and over and over. The best you get is some rhetoric from Washington, D.C., from some people about spending and the debt, but ultimately it keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And if we take Spooner for face value here, just as his words, maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, but it sure seems to be that as long as people continue going along with this, keep allowing this to happen, it will never, ever change. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. That's more important than anything. I hope you learned something. Absolutely nothing helps us get this kind of information out to more and more people every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for a mere $2 a month of that depreciated, dirty government fiat over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. No pressure to join us, but if you got a couple of bucks and want to throw it our way, I would be very grateful for your support. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Let me take a quick moment and see if I can look at some comments or questions here. Haji says, spoonerific. That is a great term. Seldom seen says depressing. It's true. I like to look, especially when we're going through nullification season. We're going to kick off nullification season pretty soon. It's this part of the year when most state legislatures are in session. We see efforts on a state and local level to resist, reject, and nullify unconstitutional federal acts, which is basically almost all of them on the books: acts, laws, orders, rules, regulations, etc. So I like to look for silver linings, small steps forward, because even the smallest step forward, as Thomas Jefferson told us, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. Even the smallest step forward is a step forward for liberty. So that is positive. But when it comes to the economic situation, it's hard to find a silver lining. Sometimes truth is what heals. So I appreciate that comment. It is depressing. It's not good news. Bastiat warned us. Yeah, no doubt. Taking a look and see if there's anything else. Madison nailed it there, Chief. Public debt is a public curse. There's so many from the founders from the founding generation, talking about how a permanent debt is a problem. Of course, as we see from Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton loved it. And that's how government has been operating all along. They use it as a tool, as a way to get what they want. And then, of course, they tie it into these so-called must-pass bills. And there's only a must-pass piece of legislation in Congress instead of everything being a must-repeal. The reason that there's a must-pass piece of legislation is because so few people are on board with the Constitution and liberty. And again, it's not going to change until people change their views. Well, I appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Again, I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you next time here on the path to liberty. Thank you so much for watching or listening.